world of education and business, perhaps based on my research experience. Most of my research life has been spent looking at the genetics of psychiatric disorders. I'm very interested in how the brain develops in the womb at the level of cell and gene, and to see what happens then when things screw up years later and you get a psychiatric disorder. And I'd like to say before we begin, we're not going to be talking about the psychiatric disorders at ASBO, so you may relax. Even though I've been asked to speak on the general topic of how the brain works, particularly in relationship to education and to business practice, I don't think brain science, at least the type of stuff that I do, has anything to say to classroom practice or business experience. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. Have the rest of the nice morning off if you like. I have a couple of reasons for my skepticism before we get started, and you may be almost immediately asking, what in the world am I going to speak on for the next 60 minutes? Let me give you some reasons for my skepticism, and then I'll tell you what I'm going to talk about. Reason number one, we actually don't know very much about how the human brain works. We don't know in real terms how you know how to pick up a glass of water and drink it. We don't know in real terms how you know how to take a pen and write your name with it. And if we ever did, we'd probably have lots of Nobel Prizes get triggered. So my first reason for skepticism is we just don't know. We are ignorant. Second reason, even if we knew everything there was to know about how the brain processes information, guys like me, who live in an ivory tower and do research all day long, do not interact with the real world very often. My laboratories, which are over in Fahey Hall in the bioengineering department at the University of Washington School of Medicine, are a kilometer away from Miller Hall, which is where all the education schools are housed. And you can spend your entire careers, 40 or 50 years at it, and never set foot in each other's halls. Now, that hasn't stopped certain mythologies from occurring, because I would argue that both business practice and education is about brain development, but there are a lot of mythologies that have occurred as a result of the compelling reason to need to know about how the brain works. How many of you have heard that you only use 10% of your brain? Have you heard that before, have you? You can take it and throw that out, that's nonsense. How many of you have heard that there is a right brain personality and a left brain personality? Have you heard that before? You can take it and throw that out. You need both hemispheres in order to have a personality. You may have heard that if you played Mozart at gestational age, 12 weeks, headphones onto the womb, that the kid is going to be coming out and being able to do second-order differential equations. Have you heard that before? You can take it and throw that out. That's a mythology. Men are from Mars. Women are from Venus. Yeah, that's probably true, actually. It sort of reminds me, though, what we end up happening is that we can end up using the exact same words, but having very different meanings when we look at them, or even seeing the exact same things, but having wildly different interpretations because of this ignorance. I'll give you an example in my own world. She's blogged about this. She's on the clinical faculty at UW, pediatrician, had a 4-year-old daughter at the time she blogged about the following story. She's in her SUV, and the 4-year-old daughter is in a car seat, good, and mom has left her stethoscope in the back seat of the car, and as they're stopped at a stoplight, mom is looking up over at the rearview mirror and sees the little girl take her little hand and just grab the stethoscope. And mom is going, "Oh, be still, my beating heart. We're going to have another pediatrician in the household." She gets more excited because the little girl actually takes the stethoscope and does what a doctor does. She puts it in her ears, and mom is going, "Oh, now we're only 15 years and a good solid MCAT score away from all kinds of good things happening in my household." And she quickly gets disabused of the impression when the little girl takes the bell of the stethoscope, puts it to her lips, and says, "Welcome to McDonald's." "May I take your order, please?" So you can look at the exact same stuff and have wildly different misinterpretations. Now, I will tell you, even though we don't know very much in real terms, either at the molecular, cellular, or behavioral levels, about how the brain works, we're not clueless, particularly if you're interested in applying what I'll just call the hard stuff, the stuff of the peer-reviewed research literature into the world of education. I would argue that the cognitive neurosciences are probably the closest academic unit to that real world. We know something about the brain's evolutionary performance envelope. In fact, we know a lot about it. Here is the brain's evolutionary performance envelope conditions under which it probably thrives the best. Here it is. The human brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an outdoor setting, in unstable meteorological conditions, and to do so in near constant motion. Okay? I'll say that again. The human brain appears to have been designed to solve problems related to surviving in an outdoor setting, in unstable meteorological conditions, and to do so in near constant motion. So, even though we don't know squat about how the brain works, if you were really interested in taking the cognitive neurosciences and applying it to the real world of the classroom and business practice, if you wanted to design a learning environment in either of those fields that was directly opposed to what the brain is naturally good at doing, you design a classroom. You design a cubicle. And if you were interested in taking the peer-reviewed, hardened stuff and actually putting wheels and an engine and a chassis and make it go somewhere in the real world, the best that I can offer you for the next now 55 minutes or so is to talk to you about some definitional things. Things we do know about how the brain works, and then have a plea that research may occur between two institutionally estranged worlds, the world of the practice of learning with the science of learning. If you had an unlimited budget and few bureaucratic constraints, tell I live in an ivory tower. But if you did and could do anything based on what we know in the cognitive neurosciences, what would you do? The question that I've been asked, the subject I've been asked to speak on is actually wrapped up in a question. It has to do with stress. One of the brain rules in my book, Brain Rules, and Brain Rules for Maybe, we talk about it both. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide this talk into 4 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about stress. If we could have the slides, please. We're going to talk, first of all, about stress and productivity in part 1. And then in part 2, we're going to talk about the brains behind the behavior, get into some brain science. Part 3 of homes and parents and brains. And part 4, if there's time, and there may not be, but if there's time, practical advice, the matter of stress and sleep. And the whole thing is garnered around a single and straightforward rule. Here are 12 things we know about how the brain works. The one we're going to be talking about, stress, is very simple and straightforward. Stressed brains do not learn the same way as non-stressed brains. Stressed brains do not learn the same way as non-stressed brains, and I'm going to talk about the fact that probably stressed brains don't learn very much at all. So, if you're taking notes, and I see some of you are, you already see that I speak at the speed of light. I teach second-year medical students and bioengineering graduate students, and I usually tell them to just take out your tape recorder. Hey, good luck. We are going to talk about part 1, specifically about behavior. Then we're going to move into the brain itself, and then we're going to talk about the practical applications, both in terms of the real world of stress reduction and then also in sleep, if there's time. So that's where we're headed, if indeed we get lost. So let's go ahead and get started. Stress and learning. What do we mean by stress? Believe it or not, it wasn't until about 15 years ago that we actually had any idea of how to define stress. There were lots of confounders for it, and I want to give you 3 to show you that it was very difficult. It wasn't until Jean-Sock Kim and David Diamond came around and gave us a definition that we actually could make sense of it to somebody who works with test tubes for a living. Here are 3 confounders. I'm going to make the strong case that a very particular type of stress hurts learning. In fact, I'm going to make a strong case that certain types of stress cause brain damage. Okay? So if we're going to talk about that for real, here are my 3 confounders. Number 1, that's not entirely true. Not all stress is bad for learning. In fact, some types of stress, a little bit of stress, that's probably pretty good for learning. It will motivate you, clear out your brain, you can see more things, serum is better oxygenated, and so on. Okay? Number 2, what is stressful for one person is not necessarily stressful for someone else. So when we're trying to come up with a definition, we get a subjective problem very, very quickly. Some people love jumping out of airplanes. For others, it's their worst nightmare. But whether it is stressful for you or not pretty much depends on lots of factors which have very little to do with your arrival in our laboratories. Number 3, if you look at the physiological panels of someone who is experiencing intense pleasure or experiencing intense stress, and you blind me to it, you just give me both panels and you ask me, Dr. Medina, which one was stressed and which one was not? I'll look at you and go, I don't know. Why? Because they're identical. What am I going to do? Well, I'll tell you what Gene Kim and David Diamond did. I'm going to tell you about an experiment that it's actually an old experiment, which they had co-opted and gave us a definition that finally makes sense, and it'll give us a better sense of what it is that we're talking about. I'm going to warn you about this story. It is G-rated, but for some of you, particularly if you are a dog lover, this is going to be very tough for you to hear, so I want to warn you in advance. More than that, probably this is an experiment that probably couldn't be done these days because Marty would get his lab firebombed. But I want to tell it to you because it gave us a very valuable insight of something that occurred in the mid-60s. And to talk to you about it specifically, I'd like to divide this hall, if you will, in half. You guys, I'm going to turn you all into German Shepherds, by the way. You guys are going to be the German Shepherds in the experimental group. Then, dividing the slide right over here, you guys are going to be German Shepherds in the control group. And I'm going to tell you what happened in the mid-60s in an experiment that probably couldn't be done today. What I'm going to do to all of you, whether you're experimental or control, I'm going to put you into metal cages, I'm going to hook it up to a battery, and I'm going to shock you every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. Okay? I'm going to make the schedule of shocks stochastic, which simply means it's in a semi-random fashion. Average is about every 10 minutes, but you actually don't know when the shocks are coming. Okay? That's not going to be enough to cause oxidative damage, but it is going to be enough to make you feel it. It is extremely uncomfortable to experience. Go! Here comes the experiment. I turn on the juice. What do you guys do? Well, I'll tell you what you do. You go nuts for the first 3 days. You're banging up against, once the shocks start to come on you, you're banging up against the side of the cage because you don't want to have it happen again, and then boom, it happens again in a semi-random fashion. You start banging up the side of the cage, biting your tail, biting your paws, you're urinating, you're defecating, you enter into eventually, by the 72nd hour, into what I like to call zoo-psychotic behavior, where the animal is just pacing back and forth like this. But then something extraordinary happens at the 96th hour. You get it, that there is not going to be a way out. None. And you go to the corner of the cage, and you just sit there, and you take it. I haven't even started the experiment yet, you guys. And I've got 10 days to go. By the 14th day, I am now ready to start the experiment. Now let's get started. You guys are the experimentals. You guys are the controls. I'm going to take the top off the cage for each of you, and I'm going to let you get out. Some of you are so stunned by this experience that I actually have to lift you out, but we can get you to run around. I'm also going to make you a little bit hungry. This is the Baylor version of this experiment. I'll make you a little bit hungry. You'll see why in just a second. What I'm going to do for you controls is that I've made you a little hungry. You've gotten out of the cage for half an hour. I'm going to put you back into the cage. I've left the roof off. Now I'm going to put the roof back on. I'm going to screw it back down, and I'm going to resume the shocks. What do you guys do? Well, I'll tell you what you do. Once the shocks come, you remember the shocks. You remember that there was no way out. You don't wait 96 frickin' hours. You go right to the corner of the cage that you had previously occupied, and you just sit there and you take it. Because you got the message that there was not only no way out, there was no actions you could connect in your mind that could actually stop the shocks, and you just give up. You guys, you are the experimentals. Scientists who did this got into the National Academy, and I'm about to tell you why. With you, I'm also going to let you out of the cage, and you're also going to run around for about a half hour or so. I'm going to put you back into the cage. You're a little bit hungry, but you, I'm not going to take I'm going to leave the roof off. I'm not going to take the roof and put it back on you. I'm going to leave it off. More than that, you're a little bit hungry, so I'm going to dangle a steak over the top. So you have a compelling reason to jump out of the cage. And I resume the shocks. What do you do? Yes, I just heard it. I will tell you what you do. Even though you have a way out, and you have a compelling reason to get out, for the last 2 weeks, there was no way out. And when all of a sudden there is a way out, you can no longer see it, and you go to the same corner of the cage that you had occupied, just like them, and you take it. Marty Seligman, the man who was first responsible for this awful experiment, coined the term learned helplessness. And from that idea, we got a definition of stress that now makes sense to a test tube. aversive junk coming at you, the more likely you are to experience the type of stress we can measure. So the whole idea is going to be focusing around control by definition, and the whole thing looks just like this. Okay, if we can have the slides back. Here's a reference for you if you're so inclined. First of all, the stress definitions are really hard to define because some stress actually aids learning, at least a little bit. Aversion perception can be quite variable. That's that parachutes jumping in and out. Pain, pleasure physiology is similar enough that we're not really sure. The two characteristics that give us have to do with control. So what I drew here is a control-o-meter. It's actually a voltmeter, forgive me. But when you begin to feel, when you are in control of the aversive stimuli coming at you, you may not even report yourself as being stressed. But the more out of control you feel, out of control measured in two dimensions, you can't control the frequency of the aversive stimuli, nor could you control the depth of the severity of it once it arrives. The more out of control you feel, the more likely you are to experience the type of stress that's going to hurt learning. The aversive stimulus is not avoidable. You are trapped. You cannot connect any of your actions with even a slight ability to modulate the presence or severity of the aversive stimulus. When you do that, and I measure your brain, you can now see this in a human being, a little 7-year-old who is going to first grade but has an alcoholic drunk dad who every night that he comes home from first grade beats him to a pulp. Yet he must go home, even though he doesn't want to go home, experiences learned helplessness. You take a look at somebody, at a human being, it was the first time we ever knew about certain types of environmental stimuli that could lead to a depression. Look what happens to your brain. Pattern matching, problem solving, memory stability short, memory stability long. Here is your non-stressed brain, so we'll call that baseline. But look what happens if I stress you. If you experience the type of stress that hurts learning, where you feel out of control, look at your ability to pattern match. Look at your ability to problem solve. Look at your ability to encode memory traces, both in terms of short-term, and certainly it's a bottleneck that is not achieved, and long-term gets hurt just as much. Stressed brains do not learn the same way as non-stressed brains. Stressed brains don't learn at all. Part 2. Stress and learning, the brains behind the behaviors. We need to come up for some air here because there's some really good news, but I'm not ready to give you that good news yet. But I am ready to talk to you about the molecules and cells about what I just said, because I told you it was a mature story. It starts out with behaviors, goes to the cells, actually ends up in the molecules. And to illustrate that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, does anybody listen to Prairie Home Companion here in this audience? Familiar with Prairie Home Companion, some of you, maybe half of you? Those of you who aren't, the guy's name is Garrison Keillor. He's a natural storyteller, probably in an earlier era would have been the Mark Twain of his generation. He has a show on NPR called Prairie Home Companion, and every year he has a joke show. And then he gives these jokes out, and he has one in particular. This is his third favorite joke of all time, which he loves. And it gives a great example of where we're going in terms of stress and brains and behavior. Here is Garrison Keillor's, one of his top 5 favorite jokes. It's about an athletic thief who breaks into a jewelry store by busting through a skylight and lowering himself down into the jewelry store, kind of like a Tom Cruise, although he's doing it via a rope. The thief goes right for the cash register, and immediately as he reaches for the cash register, he hears a voice behind him saying, with some authority, "God is watching." He turns around, sees nothing, goes back to the cash register, and as he goes back down to reach down into the cash register, once again hears the voice, "God is watching." He sees a parrot over in the corner and realizes that it's the parrot's voice. "What's your name?" the thief asks the parrot. The parrot replies, "John the Baptist." "Well, that's a funny name for a parrot," says the thief. "Who named you that?" The parrot replied, "My owner, the same guy who named the Rottweiler God." So we have an acute stress spike. What is going on in the mind of that thief? If you give him a calculus test, is he going to do very well? No, he's stressed. Most of stress that occurs in the human body is built to handle stress that happens in 30-second impulses. Did you know that? The saber-toothed tiger either ate you or you ran away, but it's all over in less than a minute. Most of stress is devoted to getting blood flow into your thighs so you can run. We sometimes call it fight or flight, but there's no fight in it. We are the Pleistocene's biggest chicken. We're built to run, to get out as fast as we possibly can. And from that insight, we know something about the brain biology behind this, and so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about it. To understand the biology behind these behaviors, I have to introduce you to two pieces of neurological real estate and two molecules and how those interact with each other, and then we'll talk about the fact, because I also said a really big thing. I said that out of control stress can actually cause brain damage, and I want to show this to you right now. Okay, so the two pieces of neurological real estate you may have heard of before. How many of you have heard of the hippocampus before? You heard that before? Okay, it sits right in the middle of the brain. Let me show you a picture of it. If we do a mid-sagittal through the brain, and then there's a lot of complex gadgets here, so let's ignore those. Let's go with that green thing. I made it a little bigger. That's the hippocampus. Here is its day job. It helps turn short-term memory into long-term memory. Now, it's not a hard drive. The brain actually doesn't have a hard drive, unless you want to think of the entire organ as the hard drive. But it actually is a driver for it. The other piece of neurological real estate I'd like to introduce you to is something you have heard of before, the adrenal glands, these are supposed to be kidneys, and the adrenals are these little turquoise things here on the top. I think of the adrenals as two pieces of brain that fell out of the cranial vault and drifted down into your mid-abdomen and landed on your kidneys. Why do I say that? Because it's so neurologically active. In fact, in order to understand stress, we need to understand the interaction between your head and mid-abdomen. So that's where we're headed. You need to know about the hippocampus, which is involved in learning, and adrenal glands. Adrenals, adrenaline, heard that before, have you? That's where it's actually coming from. Okay, those are the two pieces of neurological real estate. Now to the two biochemicals. One I call a villain, the other I call a hero. And we'll see why one's a villain, one's a hero in a second. So here's our brains again. We're going to be talking about the villain and the hero. Let's do the villain first. Secreted by the adrenal glands, they're stress hormones. Glucocorticoids, if you know a little bit about this stuff. How many of you have heard of cortisol before? Have you heard that before? Okay, it's a standard glucocorticoid. That's our villain. Here's our hero. Our hero you probably have never heard of before unless you've read Brain Rules. BDNF, Brain-Derived Neurotrophic Factor. I call it a hero because it sits there inside these cells. These are nerve cells, and nerve cells exist in the hippocampus as surely as they exist anywhere else. I'd like to direct your attention, though, to what it's above. Can you guys all read that right there? It says, life, death, switch. You actually have a self-destruct mechanism in most neurons. And BDNF is a hero because it protects you against that neuron's death. Your neuron will die, it'll fall on its molecular sword, and you can kiss it goodbye. But if you have BDNF in there, not gonna happen. BDNF is our hero. Glucocorticoid is our enemy. We got a hippocampus, we got adrenals. What happens to the mind of that thief that has done the Tom Cruise thing and is now moving on into your brain? All right, here is a tasty reference for you. This is what happens. If you were unprotected, if all you had was the villain, the adrenal gland, you're going to get stressed. The adrenals will sense it, secrete that glucocorticoid, stress hormones, goes right into the brain. Here it is right here in turquoise. It's going to go right into that cell, and watch what it's going to do. It's going to bind to that life-death switch, and when it binds to that life-death switch, you can kiss it goodbye. It will kill, because it activates the life-death switch. Okay? That's where brain damage occurs with stress. Now, your brain knows this, as if a piece of biological tissue could know something, although in the case of the brain, that's probably quite literally true. And it has your hero. Here is your hero. You've got a hero that hovers over the life-death switch. Watch what happens when you get a normal amount of stress. The stress hormones flood into your serum, go right past the blood-brain barrier, get right into that hippocampal cell, and instead of destroying it, it meets its worst enemy, BDNF. Binding to the BDNF, it does to the cortisol, and the toxic effect is blocked. In fact, this actually cleaves it. The cell will live. The life-death switch is not activated. Very powerful, very good stuff. That's what happens normally when you have stress in 30-second chunks. Problem is, if you live in our culture, if you are in a bad job and you have a bad boss, or you're in a bad marriage, the saber-toothed tiger can be at your doorstep, not for 30 seconds, but for 30 years. And when that happens, the glucocorticoids in your bloodstream do the following. If you are a dog getting electric shocks, or you are a little boy having to go home to an alcoholic dad, you have more stress than your system can handle. Watch what happens. Here's your adrenal glands, here's your hero, here's the stress, but you don't have the normal amount of stress. You have Marty Seligman's learned helplessness. You feel out of control over the aversive stimuli. And when that happens, the stress hormones go into the brain, but guess what? There's too much stress hormones in the brain, so the hero is going to try and do its thing, but you have overwhelmed the system. So even though the hero does its thing, there's still enough left over to throw the life-death switch. Those defenses are overwhelmed, and you can kiss it goodbye. Cell dies. People who experience that type of stress on a regular basis, if you image them with what's called an fMRI, non-invasive imaging, it looks like someone took a 12-gauge shotgun and blew away parts of their hippocampus. Stress can cause brain damage. Stressed brains don't learn the same way as non-stressed brains. And that's the point. Okay, part 3. Good news. We have now descended into the valley. It's Friday, but Sunday's coming. To quote an old professor of sociology. Friday's here, Sunday's coming. Part 3 is entitled Of Homes and Parents and Brains. Now, over the years, we've asked the question, are there ways that you could actually gauge this system and produce some stress compensatory behavior? Or is there any good news in here? And there's a couple pieces of good news. I want to stop this animation just a second. You guys see this right here? Do you remember BDNF, our hero? Wouldn't it be nice if you could make more BDNF than normal? Would that help? It most certainly would. Actually, in the first chapter of Brain Rules, we end up talking a lot about this because it has been recently discovered, to my great chagrin, aerobic exercise will increase BDNF levels. Darn. I'll show it to you. BDNF levels, that's one thing that can happen. So if you're a psychiatrist, I work in the mental health community a lot. I actually am part of the national faculty for continuing medical education. And one of the things they're beginning to recommend for depression, particularly if you are interested and locked into this learned helplessness stuff, is that you can make more BDNF. Is that what exercise actually does for people? The answer to that question is yes, that's exactly what exercise does. And so powerful is this. By the way, this is something you can't try at home. It's going to be published in the Journal of JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, in a minute, probably in a month. It's stuck up in peer review. If you have a depression and you are taking Zoloft for it, okay? This is something, by the way, you can't try at home. You can't try at home. If you have a normal depression, it's called an F33.1 major depression, okay? And you are in the hands of a competent psychotherapist, good fit your psychotherapist is, and they have prescribed the right amount of Zoloft so that you're within the therapeutic range of the drug. What is the percent chance of you being substantially better 12 months after you started the journey with your psychotherapist and the right amount of Zoloft? Answer is 80%, 80. It's one of the highest replication successful treatment rates in the world for just about any disorder. Now, people knew about this over at Johns Hopkins and other places too, John Pennick's work. Ask the question, we know about BDNF. It is protected for the brain. What if we did this? What if we allowed, you had your good psychotherapist for sure, but we subtracted the Zoloft and instead put in a 5-day-per-week rigorous aerobic workout. No antidepressant in sight. You actually have to tail it down. No antidepressant in sight. Just lots of treadmill activity. What is the percent chance of you getting better 12 months later in the hands of a competent psychotherapist and now in a treadmill? Answer is 80%. They're identical. There are no frickin' side effects, except a reduction in the risk of type 2 diabetes. That's why if read Brain Rules, I had to put a treadmill in my office. Otherwise, the hypocrisy meter would go off. Okay, there's some good news here, and I want to talk to you about it. In fact, one of the first hints that there was going to be control, this is very interesting. This was done with a group of high school students students that were having to take math tests. And they were good, they were pretty average. They would get normally a 70, 75% on a math score. They asked the question, you know, what if we, because for math, a lot of people have phobia with it, what if we allowed you to write down your fears before you took the math test? Give you 15 minutes of what's called expressive writing, where you just write down, and we ask what your grades were. Could that begin to alleviate certain types of stress? One of the things that was noticed almost immediately, here's the expressive writing that was allowed 15 minutes prior, no expression allowed, or the controls. And what was found was interesting is that people's glucocorticoids, their cortisol levels, started to go down the instant they started writing about their fears. So the question was then asked, what's your math score look like? Well, I'd like to show you. These are randomized, blinded, placebo-controlled. Great studies. You get a 21% boost simply by writing down your fears. So there seem to be little bits of hints of things that you can do. Now, to the good news of homes and parents and brains, to answer this question about homes, we're going to be going right into it for a second. The greatest single predictor of academic success that exists in the United States of America is the emotional stability of the home. Did you know that? That's probably because of its effects on something we call executive function, which is a direct result of stress. To give you an example of this, and this is where we're headed, I'd like to, if I can tell a story about another pediatrician, also female, also on the clinical faculty at the University of Washington, who has a 6-year-old daughter and a husband who is in it's a good marriage, it's going to last the distance, no question about it, but it is a very traditional marriage. Husband is a biochemist, has lots of program projects and grants and about $1 million a year, has lots of postdocs and graduate students, many of them from South Asia and the People's Republic of China. And every year, because so many of them can't go back to their home countries for Christmas, he calls them Christmas orphans. And the generosity of his heart, he invites them all over for Christmas dinner. Bless his heart, and they come. But because it is a traditional marriage, even though it's his laboratory, guess, and they both have careers, guess who has to do the dinner? Yeah, she does. Guess who has to do the cleanup? She does. So as the Christmases went by, you can imagine she starts getting pretty pissed off by this after a while. She does. 6-year-old daughter, she's now, you could argue that passive-aggressive formation is not exactly a good stress reduction therapy. It wasn't, but she's banging the pots and pans around because she's mad. And the 6-year-old little girl is actually breaking this all in. Talking about family dynamics here, and this is actually where we're headed, she calls to her husband. All the postdocs and graduate students are in the television room talking science. And she says, honey, it's time for dinner, through clenched teeth. So they all come in, they all sit down, and mom looks at the little girl, still really agitated, and says, honey, would you mind saying the blessing? The little girl is scared out of her mind. She goes, yeah, I would mind, Mom. No, I'm not gonna, I wouldn't know what to say. Mom says, actually faithful words. She says, that's all right, dear. You just say what you hear Mommy say. Little girl all of a sudden relaxes, closes her eyes, and says in a really booming voice, oh God, why did my husband have to invite all these jerks for dinner? So we got a stressed household. We have a stressed household. The stress in those households is much more severe than that. It's actually a pretty marriage, and they've got a lot going on. They're great folks. Nonetheless, the stress in the household, if expanded over the length of a marriage, is actually a greater predictor of a kid's academic success than the kid's IQ. So if you were really interested in asking questions about education reform or how to apply business, brain science to business practice, and if you had an unlimited budget and few bureaucratic constraints and could do anything, given the natural skepticism that exists between these two worlds, would you go into a place that is none of your business and get inside someone's marriage and ask the question, what could I do there to reduce the stress? And would that change the kids' brains coming through that system? Good question to ask. None of your business question to ask, I totally get that. But I deal with psychiatric disorders all day long, as you know, and I realized very quickly that there's no such thing as social boundaries between these types of questions. And if you really were interested in the hard peer-reviewed stuff, I'm about to give you some. Here we go. Let's talk about stress, families and dynamics. And to do that, we have to talk about a statistic and introduce you to he's actually a friend of mine, did some research, actually funded some of his work for a while. His name is John Gottman. How many of you have heard of John Gottman before? Anybody here? A couple? One or two? It's actually emeritus out here in Seattle. How many of you read the book Blink by Malcolm McDowell? Then, okay, well then you've undoubtedly heard about John Gottman. John is one of the world's authorities in Western marriage. And one of the things he found out almost instantly looking at the relationship between kids and marriage is this. In Kane County, which is where Seattle resides, if you have a baby, the amount of marital conflict on average goes up 9-fold by the time that kid is 6 months of age. You know that? By the time that kid is 12 months of age, the amount of marital satisfaction as reported by the female has plummeted by 70%. That's zero. And the part of the guy, 0%! So by the time the kid is 12 months of age, there's a huge disparity in what people think is their relationships are headed. Most importantly, the amount of what's sometimes called PPD, it's actually more F33.1 major depression, sometimes called postpartum depression. That, whatever you want to call that, that form of depression is in groups that are not being treated. Mothers, 61% of the cohort generally has a depressive episode sometime by the time the kid is 12 months of age. Whereas the controls without kids, females, is about 23.8%, 24%. So, having a baby in King County, it's wonderful to have kids. That can be pretty stressful on a marriage. And that's where John comes in. He's asking the question, and if you've read Blink, you already know this. He created something that is called the Love Lab. And here is the Love Lab. The Love Lab, in its original incarnation, was a multi-hour test whereby a married couple comes in and sits down at a table where they all get hooked up with EKGs and perhaps ERP caps on their heads to measure blood flow, and maybe a GSR, galvanic skin response, to measure stress hormones that are coming out. They're peeing into a cup every 3 hours to get the stress hormone. It's like a turkey at Thanksgiving, this poor couple. And there's two of them. Mom and Dad. And it actually doesn't matter whether you've got kids or not. You're going to get the exact same results. This is what he's going to do. The Love Lab. Multi-hour test. 2 video cameras on each participant because he's also coding the behaviors. His PhD, John's PhD, is in applied mathematics, which I think has done his psychology a world of good because he can really parse a tremendous amount of this out. And boy, did he ever. He gives the couple a question. Here's the question, couple rigged up like turkeys at Thanksgiving. Do something that requires a mutually agreed to goal. Hey, couple, go ahead. Remodel your house together. Raise your kids together. Yeah, go ahead. Well, what he's doing is he's measuring actually conflict management. That's for sure. First hour, everybody's on good behavior, but you know, you got multi-hours to go, so that first hour's an outlier. He's going to throw it away. But at the end, he triangulates the physiology with self-report and the coded behaviors on the part of the video camera, gives the couple a score